Good evening. Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. My name is Don Cooney. I'm Vice Mayor of the City of Kalamazoo and an Associate Professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University. And I'm here today with Felix Brooks, who is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and International Admissions at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. Felix, good to be with you again.
Thanks, good to be here as well.
So we're going to talk today about an issue that's been talked all over the state, actually all over the country, and that is the Flint water crisis. So Felix, why don't we start off by you giving us an overview of what happened here and where are we today?
Actually, it's sort of ironic that both of us have in front of us a cup of water. And we tend to take this for granted that when we drink this water, that it's going to be safe. And when we think about bad water, we often think about third world countries. But this problem hits close to home. This is in the state of Michigan, in the city of 100,000, Flint, Michigan. Longtime General Motors town, full of hard-working folks who actually deserve better. But the history of this actually starts with the appointment of an emergency manager. And the state of Michigan has appointed emergency managers in several municipalities around the state, Flint being one, Benton Harbor, Pontiac, my hometown, Detroit. We've all had been under the thumb of an emergency manager. And what I mean under the thumb, what I mean is that this person comes in and he or she has complete authority over how the city is run, particularly in the area of finances. Their job design and description is to try to bring that city back into some sort of fiscal management.
Right. So the emergency manager, appointed by the governor, comes into a city. The elected officials are pushed to the side.
Yep.
They have no power. I remember that when the emergency manager was first appointed to Benton Harbor, he told the elected officials, the city commission and the mayor, you have the ability to call a meeting, take the roll, and end the meeting. Everything else is up to me.
Correct.
And so that's what was going on in Flint. This guy had complete authority.
And one of the decisions that he made, along with a number of other cost-cutting measures, was the decision to change the city's water supply from the Detroit River, which it had come from for decades, to the Flint River. Actually, not the Detroit River, but it would be Lake
Huron.
Water, Lake Huron water.
Right.
Just outside of Detroit.
One of the cleanest waters in the world.
Clean water supply.
Yeah.
And then to get their supply of water from the Flint River, which had long been a dumping ground for a number of corporations for many, many years. And you have to know that river water and lake water have different properties. Right. And that's the crux of this issue.
That's the fundamental thing.
You know? And so once they switched water supplies, for a lot of families, it became clearly evident just in the color of the water that something was wrong, that this water was not right. And this goes back several years. This is not a crisis that happened in the last 2 months. If you watch the news, you would think this is something fairly new, but this has been going on since, what, April of 2014?
2014.
When people looked at the water that was coming out of their taps and looked at it, the discoloration of it, and said, this is not right. Something's not right here. Something is fundamentally wrong with this water.
And there was an initial problem with the switch about a chemical that wasn't put into the pipes. Can you talk about that for a minute?
And here's what happened with that. It's normal protocol around the country, and in a number of articles that I've read and listened to a number of news reports, that when you switch to a river supply of water, that water is typically more corrosive. And so there are anti-corrosive measures that you can put in place that would have cost the city, I think, $150 a day to do that. And had they done that at the beginning, what that would have done is it would have stopped the water from leaching away elements in the pipes. And in this case, in cities like Flint, you got old infrastructure. That element that leached away was lead.
Right.
And the fact that that anti-corrosive piece was not put in place, we go from water that did not corrode pipes and did not allow them to leach into the people's water supply to something that did.
Yeah, and I talked to an engineer this week, and he told me that is so automatic that everybody who works in this area knows that if you're making that kind of a change, you automatically put this chemical into the pipes, and they just didn't do it.
And it just begs the question, you have to ask yourself, did they ever have a conversation when they were sitting down talking about making the move from Detroit water supply to Flint water supply? What are the things that we need to have in place to make this transition as smooth and seamless as possible? And I would like to believe that they asked those questions, but in my mind, at least from the evidence that we've seen, nobody asked those questions.
Right.
Which is sort of begs the question, like, well, what were you thinking about?
Right. Or else they just expected that the engineers would do that. But it's gross incompetence at the minimum.
And when people began to complain, particularly about the color of the water, and some parents were reporting rashes on their kids, what they were told fundamentally was that this water is fine. Don't worry about it. You're not going to have any problems with it. And they were not only told that at the city level through the Office of the Emergency Manager, but also at the state level, where the second set of issues started to arise. Because there was a parent who had a couple kids, female, who saw some noticeable changes in the development of her twins, and took her kids to a doctor who said to her, your problems stem from the water. We think that we not only think, we know that your kids are getting excessive amounts of lead in their water. This is a problem. Not only is this a problem now, but it's a problem that can cause permanent damage to your kids later on. Not only to your kids, but kids all over the city. And when this evidence was presented to folks at the Department of Environmental Quality for the state of Michigan, again, they were told there's no problems.
So there was resistance.
Yeah, there was resistance.
They didn't want to hear it.
You know, their posture was, instead of listening to folks who were coming to them telling them that there's problems with this water, was what can we do to discredit them? So what this parent did is she went so far as to get a hold of, through whatever channel she had, through a professor at Virginia Tech University,
right,
who was an expert in this sort of thing. He comes. He takes his water samples, and he says, excessive levels of lead in this water, dangerous levels of lead in this water, particularly for adolescent and young kids developing. His findings are also pushed off to the side at the state level.
So he's a recognized expert.
Yep.
He comes in, tests it, says, we're in trouble here. This is bad news, what's going on with this water. And instead of saying, okay, well, let's see if this guy's right, all the evidence would be for him that because he's got the credentials, they just say, no, this is just a political ploy, make us look bad, and we're not going to buy it.
And that's what they went about the business of doing, was discrediting the messengers. Instead of saying, you know, there's an alternative narrative here that we might want to take a look at and investigate, they tried to say, well, the way he took his data and the time of year that he took his data made his results invalid. Therefore, we're not going to pay any attention to it. So
did they do any testing themselves?
They said they tested themselves, and when they came back, their results showed that the water, again, was okay. That those lead levels that were in the water were acceptable. Now, I don't know what standard they used to test the water, but they said it was acceptable. And they actually said that it met the EPA standards for safe water.
And how wrong they were is subsequently proved, again, incompetence or deliberate deceit.
And there's some political implications to this, political and racial implications to this, because you and I talked about this before we came on, that the city of Flint is a city that's a minority city.
Yes.
And that fundamentally alters the equation because they don't have a constituency in Lansing.
That's right.
The legislature is led by Republicans, and Flint is largely a Democratic city, and so they're not seen as a priority for the state. Yeah. You know, you and I know, Don, if this is a Grosse Pointe or Birmingham or Portage or Grand Rapids, that the state would have responded much faster
immediately
than they did here.
Immediately.
I mean, the first time a person walks into a city commission meeting in the city of Flint with a jug of water that's oranges in color that you can't even see through, and he's been told that this water is fine, you can drink it, you know there's a problem.
Oh, the response would have
Yeah.
been strong, immediately, we got to fix this. No, but this didn't matter.
This did not seem to matter. And all the while, according to the reports we're hearing from the governor, he's totally oblivious that any of this is going on.
How could that be?
Yeah, that's the question that I asked myself. How could that be? I mean, because you think to yourself, you're the governor of the state of Michigan. You have to read the newspapers. This stuff was showing up in the newspapers
Right.
in April
Right.
and May of 2014.
Right, right.
So either your people weren't telling you this, or you were totally oblivious. I have a difficult time believing that he did not have any inkling at all that something was awry, or didn't ask people to follow up.
That is incredible. It's just not credible that he. How would he not know that? Anyhow, but he denies that he knew anything
denies that
about
he
it.
knew anything about it.
And we're talking now. It's 2 years later,
Yep.
and this was surfacing in 2014.
Yep,
Meanwhile,
2014.
these kids and all the people of Flint are drinking poison water.
They're showing up with rashes. It's impacted some of these kids the way they develop, because what we know about any heavy metal, particularly lead, is lead causes permanent damage
Right.
that doesn't manifest itself in folks till sometimes years down the road in terms of how they developed.
Now, one of the things that I read that was really interesting was that there were indications that they knew something in Lansing. For example, General Motors. General Motors plant in Flint
Yep.
complained to the governor that his office, anyhow, maybe
Yep.
not to the governor, but his office, saying, look, the water is corrosive to our parts. We don't want to use this water. So they hooked up the General Motors plant at a cost of some $400,000 to the state to water that was coming, I guess, from Lake Huron.
To an
that
alternative
cleaned it
water
up.
supply, because
So-
they knew.
So that General Motors was made safe.
Yeah.
But that didn't carry over to say, wow, I wonder what's going on
Yeah,
here.
Why not the people?
Why not the people?
Because they recognized, because they could see it. They could see this water was doing serious
Right,
damage
right.
to their infrastructure. And,
Right.
and so that was going to cost them millions of dollars.
Absolutely.
So immediately they said, they're a corporate citizen. They had the wherewithal to make the change. They were able to do that. The
Yeah.
people of Flint, not so fortunate, because they had to depend on the people who were in charge to say, you know what, we made a mistake here. We're going to change this.
Right.
But what too often happens in these cases when people adopt the narrative about how we're going to do things, they are loath to walk back.
Yeah.
When somebody else says, you know what, that change you guys made there, not so good for folks.
Right. There's political
Yeah, yeah.
implications for that. We have to admit that we made a mistake. And that's one thing a politician doesn't ever want to do, to admit that they made a mistake.
Particularly when the folks who are saying you made the mistake are largely poor people
Yeah.
who
Right.
don't have a real voice in Lansing or tend to be ignored by the legislature. And they were the ones making the loudest complaints. So you have families, you have a physician, you had this guy from Virginia Tech, but also at the federal level, you had a doctor by the name, I think his name is Del Toro, who worked
Yeah.
for the EPA.
EPA, right.
Who also came to the same conclusion.
And EPA silenced him.
And EPA silenced him.
So now we got the local government, the state government, and the federal government all complicit in this whole thing. And it's because we're pushing these people to the side. They don't count.
And the big piece to that is someone obviously understood that this was going to cost a whole lot of money.
Right.
That
Right.
you're sitting on a powder keg here. And if we acknowledge that, then who do we hold accountable? And then how far does that accountability go up to? Is it just stick with officials from the Department of Environmental, Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, or does it go up to the governor's desk?
Right.
And what we know now is that the people that have been laid off or resigned all happen to be, by coincidence, at lower level jobs.
So where we are now is, after 2 years, finally it is undeniable that there's lead in the water, and something has to be
Yeah.
done. And this week there was a hearing in Congress, in the House, committee in the House, about what went on here. And what happened was finger pointing.
Yeah.
It was the state's fault. It was the city's fault. It was the EPA's fault. Nobody is really taking responsibility. Governor Snyder says he's taking responsibility, but he's very qualified responsibility that he's taking.
He's only throwing pennies at the
Right,
problem.
exactly.
Because this is going to require a complete infrastructure makeover.
Huge, huge.
And that costs money.
Costs a lot of money.
In a state that's been cutting budgets and cutting money to cities for the last, 10 years.
The New York Times had an interesting editorial a couple weeks ago. And it looked at this and it said, you know what? The fundamental thing is we don't allow people in our cities to drink poison water. That's it. So whatever else happens, that's the bottom line. So let's fix this problem.
That's the problem.
And the state should step in and do it. And they pointed out that in this year's budget in the state, we have something like a $600 million surplus.
In our rainy day fund.
A rainy day fund of $600 million. So it's not like there's no money out there.
No, the money's there.
The money's there, and this federal government should chip in some. So if it's a priority, we should fix that darn thing. And they suggested that if the state won't fix it, the federal government should fix it and send the state a bill.
And it's funny because I think what you see going on here is this sort of game of chicken.
Yeah.
Where the feds are saying, we acknowledge, we know you guys have a serious problem there, but you're going to have to put a whole lot more skin in the game than the $30 million you put on the table.
Yeah.
And maybe if we see that happening, we're going to pitch in some too.
Yeah.
But you got to put some skin in the game because you created this problem.
So meanwhile, the people in Flint are drinking bottled water. They're getting these filters to put on their, and the value of a house in Flint is completely gone. I mean, and for the most of Flint, well, a tremendous percentage of the people in Flint are poor and African American, and the only wealth that they have is
in
their
their home.
house,
In their home.
and now their home is worthless.
Yep.
Yeah, because who's going to buy a house in Flint if you can't drink the water?
Yep. Exactly.
So the damage that has been done there, it's incredible.
And that's just the infrastructure damage.
Yeah.
The hidden damage that we don't know is what impact is this going to have on all these young kids who've been drinking this water for the last 2 years, who have been told that this water was safe to drink, and who basically didn't have any alternative because people weren't pouring into town at that time with bottles of water for them. So we had all this time that went by where the people were drinking this water, bathing in this water, washing their clothes in this water, and it was contaminated. And so we don't know what the long-term impact is going to be on those kids.
Right.
And so the other secondary cost is who's going to ante up and pay for that?
That has to happen. These kids have to be monitored.
Yep.
They have to be treated as much as they can. Some of it's permanent damage. They can't.
Yep.
But they can do some things for them, and they have to do that. They have to do that.
I think there's no way around that. And that's what the state legislature and the governor has to own up to. Is that even if the feds come in and help us out, that's short term.
Yeah.
That's infrastructure stuff.
Yeah.
This other part, the human aspect of this, the state has to ante up. And they have to be willing to pay for money. So to me, it's a test of leadership. How well you lead depends, to me, how well you do by your poorest people.
Exactly. That's the measure of the success.
That's the measure of whether or not you actually you're going to step into the breach and make a statement that this actually matters to us.
Right.
And right now, the state hasn't stepped up and made that kind of statement.
They've given exact opposite impression. The impression that these people don't count. This is the same government which gave a huge tax break to the corporations when they first got into office.
$1 billion.
$1 billion. So things had to be cut. And one of the things they've cut is aid to the cities. I can tell you that right now for Kalamazoo. And so what's really being taken care of are the people at the top, and the people at the bottom are just pushed to the side.
And the other side issue here is that we know, because Michigan is an old industrial state,
Right.
that Flint is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
You have to imagine that a lot of the older cities in this state, and articles are starting to come out about that too, all have this potential problem.
Right.
Because they all have aging infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not even just in Flint. North Carolina, there are cities in North Carolina that have this problem. Washington, D.C. has this problem. And so this is a huge problem. It's an outcome of the total neglect of the infrastructure that's going on and the complete neglect of the people. Seems to me that there is a strong connection between what happened to the people in Flint and what's happening to the schools in Detroit.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no more obvious example of saying that these people don't count.
Well, they don't deserve it as much as everybody else does. It's an equity issue.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
To me, it's New Orleans all over
Yeah.
again. It's just like when a hurricane came through and those people were just neglected and pushed to the side. Now we see it in our own state.
And somebody, one of the reporters refers to this as Governor Snyder's Katrina moment.
You're right. Exactly. Exactly. And, it would seem like the response of the state should be drop everything.
Yeah.
This is an emergency. We got people here who are drinking poison water. We got kids here who are already contaminated. Forget everything else. We're going to do this. Instead of that, it's a political football.
It's a political football.
We'll kick it back and forth. We'll see who bends first and get the money from them. And meanwhile, we're just going our way. But we can't let that happen.
And the thing about it is we've got thousands of people who are involved in these really positive campaigns to take bottled water to the people of Flint.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing, but that only solves part of the problem.
Yes.
That's a temporary fix.
Absolutely. The answer to this problem cannot be bottled water. You can't take a shower in bottled water. You can't cook. Well, you could cook with bottled water, but you can't have your daily needs taken care of with bottled water.
So it's a short-term solution at best.
And what a boon to the bottled water people this whole thing is. And Michael Moore had an article that one of the staff closest to Governor Snyder, his wife is one of the on the board of Nestle's, which takes 200,000 gallons of water a day out of Michigan and bottles it. So there's a conflict of interest right there because bottled water is linked very much to the Snyder administration. Yeah, so it's a problem. So I think one of the things is this issue is not going to go away.
No, it's not going to go away at all.
And it's going to have to be faced, and the longer they take to face it, the worse it's going to be.
And the fact of the matter is they need to own up to the fact that this is going to cost the taxpayers of this state a great deal of money, but it has to be spent.
It has to be spent.
Has to be spent. And for too
Right.
long, this legislature has been telling folks, you pay too much in taxes. And as a result, what have we done? We've neglected our infrastructure.
Yeah,
So what we have in Michigan is a microcosm of what's going on all over the country.
exactly.
We want to alleviate people from paying taxes, but not understanding that you got all this infrastructure
Right.
that has to be repaired.
Absolutely, it has to be repaired. And so we're going to have to see where this goes. Now, I think the pressure has to be kept on the government because they're not going to do anything unless the pressure mounts and forces them into a position
we
where
saw
they gotta act.
basically almost 2 years of them doing nothing.
Right.
And then when the voices got louder and louder and louder, all of a sudden that's changed. When people like Rachel Maddow and the New York Times start printing stories about this, now all of a sudden they start throwing a little bit of money towards the problem, but they don't give you any idea what the long-term fix is going to be.
That's right.
Now, Rachel Maddow, I think she had a town hall meeting in Flint earlier last week, and she talked to a bunch of plumbers. And she said, she asked these guys, well, how long do you think it would take? She said, if we could get all the people here that we need to get here, we could fix this in about 6 months.
Wow. Wow.
And what the government is telling us, this is going to take a long time. She says, no, plumbers know what needs to be done.
Yeah.
So the question is, do the people who know how to do this work and the people who are going to pay for this work to be done, are they ever going to get in the same room?
Right.
And sit down and say, how are we going to solve this problem?
Yeah.
Or are they going to continue to talk past one another at the political level?
It's one of the biggest challenges that we face. How do we get these issues on the public agenda? If they're on a public agenda, they can be solved. But until they get on the public agenda, there's a lot of competing interests that don't want them to get on the public agenda, and that's what we got to get beyond. Now, besides the lead, there's also the problem of Legionnaire's disease, which it seems very clearly is connected to the whole switch. And the governor claims that he didn't know anything about this until recently, but there are some emails now that suggest that at least his office,
His office was aware.
knew this at least a year ago.
Yeah.
And Legionnaire's disease is fatal, clearly. And they didn't respond to that.
And I think the cases they've seen incidents of 5 times the normal rate of Legionnaire's disease, which puts it raises a real red flag.
Right.
That something's going on there. We may not know what the root of it is, but I don't find it to be a coincidence that those rates started shooting up after they changed the water supply.
Right.
So something's going on there.
Yeah. I think the gross neglect, the disregard of the people, that those people don't count, is so clear. And I want to go back to the Detroit schools. I mean, that makes visible the complete neglect, the complete disregard of those people and the kids in those communities. I mean, we know that the schools, many of them are filled with mold, many of them have rats, many of them have leaks in their roof. They showed a picture in the New York Times of the floor of a gym, which is completely, you can't even use it because the floor is just totally damaged from the water coming underneath. But that just goes on. That kind of stuff happens in the third world.
Exactly.
It can't happen here. It shouldn't happen here. We have the resources to deal with that.
And the state has a fundamental obligation to make sure that each and every kid has access to an education.
Right.
And a good education.
Yeah.
Again, it's an equity issue. And that means you need to give folks what they need.
Yeah.
And what the Detroit schools need right now is a better infrastructure, better funding. They have to have that going forward.
Yeah, and I don't see any great initiative around that. You know, I lived for a while in Nicaragua, and in Nicaragua, you can't drink the water outside of the capital. Managua is the only place you can drink the water. And even there, I lived with a Nicaraguan family, and we would boil the water every night before we would drink it the next day. But that's because they're a poor country. They don't have any money. They don't have money for a decent water system. That's not the case here.
Not the case here at all.
No.
We can do better.
We can do a lot better, right.
And fundamentally, at some point in time, the legislature and the legislatures have to own up to the fact that this is going to cost us money as a state.
Yeah.
But this is money that we need to spend.
Yeah.
And stop selling the Kool-Aid that you pay too much in taxes.
Yeah, right.
This is somebody else's problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem for the entire state.
It is a problem for the entire state. And I think it raises the fundamental questions, as you said, about what is our responsibility towards people? What is our responsibility toward children? Who you can say, oh, well, these other people, man, they don't work or whatever, which I totally disagree with. But kids did nothing wrong.
No.
And why should we penalize them? Why should we move in on them?
You know, and it just says a great deal about us as a state.
Yeah.
How we responded to the situation, which does not put us in the most favorable light whatsoever.
Right, right. So what do you think about the significance of the two Democratic presidential candidates scheduling their debate in Flint on March the 6th?
It shows one thing for certain, that they at least read the papers more than our own governor does. Because it was funny, because when they went to the Rubio campaign several weeks ago and asked him if he was aware of this, he had no clue.
Wow.
He said, "No, we don't have any idea that any of this is going on." I mean, you mean people in the country that you want to be president of are being poisoned, and nobody on your staff has brought you up to speed on these issues? He had no clue.
Wow, incredible. Well, of course, that's what comes out in the Republican debates. They never talk about poverty. They never talk about race. They never talk about inequality. That's all off the agenda with them. What they talk about is how tough they are, what they're going to do to ISIS militarily, and how they're going to make the economy grow. But the economy growing without saying anything about how the wealth is distributed is just bankrupt. That's no good at all. Right, right. So I think that it's interesting that this, I think, raises a fundamental issue for the presidential campaigns. Who counts? Do ordinary people count? And what are we going to do about that?
Especially when, on the Republican side, they've been talking about criticizing our president for not keeping people safe. Well, this poisoning of water in Flint is not keeping people safe, but you're not talking about that.
Right.
We don't hear anything. We don't hear a boo out of any Republican candidates about this. And this is right here at home. This is in our backyard.
Yeah.
This is fundamental. This is long-term stuff that's going to damage people for a long time, and you're not talking about that.
Right. Not at all. Not even on agenda. Not even acknowledge that there is a problem. Not even. It's off their radar. They don't even know that this exists. They don't talk about it. But I think they're going to be forced to talk about it. They're going to have to face this. They're going to have to look at this. So maybe we could switch a little bit now into the presidential situation. So it was interesting in Iowa that even though Donald Trump claimed that he was going to run away with it, he didn't win. And
a humbling experience for him because he's a guy that throughout the entire campaign up to that first vote would let you know the difference between who he thought were the winners and who he thought were losers.
Yeah.
And he didn't see himself in that losing
Not
category.
at all. Not at all.
And now he's had to sort of reframe his whole narrative about what happened in Iowa because he didn't expect to lose.
Right. Right.
But my understanding of the politics is that he did not have a very good ground game in Iowa in terms of having infrastructure and
People on the streets.
People on the streets in all whatever 90 counties there are there.
Right. Yeah.
And Ted Cruz did.
Right.
And so fundamentally, he got beat by a better politician, at least up to this point in the game, and that all the bluster and all the stuff that he said didn't translate into actual votes on the ground.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And in fact, he nearly defeated Marco Rubio.
Right.
Rubio finished a strong third in the state of Iowa, and that wasn't expected.
Not
I'm
at
sure
all.
Trump wasn't expecting that.
No.
He expected to win.
So as we're recording this, New Hampshire's on the agenda now, and the election will be next Tuesday. He has to win New Hampshire, or else he's in deep trouble.
I would think that he's in serious trouble, because given the narrative that he's put out about himself,
right, I'm a winner.
I'm a winner. You lose these two states, what are you going to say?
Right.
And then the question is, how much momentum does he lose going into those others in those March primaries?
That's right.
You know, especially if Marco Rubio finishes strong there, or even beats him in New Hampshire.
Wow. Then he's in trouble.
Then I think he's
Deep
in trouble.
in trouble. Yeah.
But then the question would be whether or not he decides at that point in time to take his ball and go home.
Yeah.
And decide to run as a third-party candidate.
That will be very, very interesting. Yeah. Right. To tell you the truth, all those guys scare me. I mean, Ted Cruz's message, I mean, I think he alienates so many people. The whole issue of inequality is completely off the agenda for every one of these guys except John Kasich. That if any of them would win, I can't imagine that they would respond to something like the Flint crisis or Detroit in a way that would be appropriate.
Nope.
They don't even talk about that kind of a thing.
It would be off their radar.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think the Republican establishment is somewhat eased, at least at this point in time, although it's still early, by the fact that Marco Rubio has such a strong showing in Iowa.
Right.
Because I don't think they favor either Trump or Cruz.
No, I don't think so either. But I think Rubio's very dangerous in a lot of the things that he holds.
Inexperience.
Very much of a hawk.
Doesn't engage well,
No.
in terms of his ability to engage folks out there, no.
No.
Too polished, too proper.
Yeah.
Everything seems to be stage managed for him.
Yeah, right. And the narrowness of his approach, like when he talked about Christianity, and they said, well, some people are looking at you as a savior, and he says, my savior is the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, good for you, but how about the people that aren't Christians that are in this country? What about them? Do they count, or where do they fit in? What's going on with them? This whole effort to court evangelicals that Cruz did, and even not Rubio certainly did, but also Trump, with Jerry Falwell Jr. Being a moderator of a discussion with him. Yeah.
And then they moved to New Hampshire, where the evangelical element is nowhere near as big in New Hampshire as it is in Iowa. So it's a different demographic.
Right.
So one wonders then what the appeal is going to be. We'll see. We'll have an idea during their next debate.
Yeah, yeah.
which I think is going to be, so what, Saturday night?
I don't, is it
Yeah,
this?
I think the Republican debates
Okay,
is on Saturday,
okay.
so.
Yeah, probably is, right. So what about on the Democratic side? What did you think about Iowa for the Democrats?
Well, I think for Hillary Clinton, there had to be a whole lot of echoes of 2008.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, at one point she was over 40 points ahead.
She had been the front runner for so long.
Right.
And I think Bernie Sanders' message is resonating. If you saw the breakdown between the young voters,
Right.
I think he had, what, 84% of the people in the 18 to 25 age range?
Yeah.
That's unprecedented
Unbelievable.
in electoral politics. As long as they've been taking these sort of polls, breakdowns have always been a lot closer than that, but 84%?
84%. Wow. And he ended in a virtual tie.
Yep.
Virtual tie. And it's amazing to me that he got so many young people out to vote, because they don't tend to get involved in that caucus at all.
And I think he energized a lot of the same people, not to the same numbers that President Obama did in 2008.
Oh, okay.
I think because of the message,
Yeah.
the strong social justice message.
Right.
And a lot
Right.
of students, particularly if you follow this year's down, you know what's going on our college campuses. Social justice, that resonates with a lot of young people.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because they're experiencing the injustice of it. They're coming up with this enormous debt, and they don't know where they're going to be able to work, and they don't know how they're going to support a family. So that's resonating
And his
with
social justice message is such a strong anti-Wall Street message. That also resonates with kids,
Yeah.
particularly with kids who grew up and started to mature after the 2008 meltdown.
Right.
So,
Right.
so this is when these kids have started to mature. So he brings that message out, and that resonates with them.
Absolutely, absolutely, and they're joining the campaign, and it is, so it's going to be interesting. Bernie's heavily favored, I guess, in New Hampshire.
He's got a 20, 30-point lead there.
Yeah, but then he has to go into South Carolina and into Nevada and then into Super Tuesday.
And that's when it'll get interesting.
Right.
Because he may very well win in New Hampshire, but that trek to the south, where his message doesn't play as strong,
Right,
is going to be difficult for him at best.
right.
But what we can't predict is what happens momentum-wise.
Yeah.
Momentum is a funny thing.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, if he wins in New Hampshire and he wins going away, that may change some people's conception of him and make them think that maybe he's more viable as the campaign moves south.
and Nevada would be more. He'd have a much better chance in Nevada, I think, than he would down there. But I think that the fundamental. This is me, anyhow. That what I hear, first of all, either one of those people would be infinitely better than what we're getting from
on
the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least in the debates, they talk about real issues. They talk about inequality. They talk about militarism. They talk about the campaign financing.
Talk about corporate influence.
Corporate influence. They talk about health care and things like that. These other people, that's just not anything that they get concerned about.
You know, they tend to rest their message is resonating more with trying to scare people.
Yeah.
To make you fearful.
Right.
Because they know that if you can introduce fear or the concept of scarcity into the campaign, that people are going to respond to that.
And they are responding to that. The turnout in Iowa was amazing.
Yes.
They had an enormous turnout. So this message of fear and exclusivity, xenophobia, that we're scared of these other people, we got to keep these people away, that resonated with a lot of people, and that scares me.
There was a column, and I'm sure you saw it in the New York Times yesterday, about this whole notion of the fear on the part of many whites about the fact that the demographics in this country are changing.
Yes.
And I think that's what Trump and Cruz tap into.
Yeah.
That's the fear they tap into, that demographic is changing, and that means fundamentally the neighborhood's changing, only not like in the 60s and 70s, there's no place for people to go.
Right.
You can't move away now.
No, you can't go to suburbs.
So,
And I think that's crucial, that last year there were less white babies born than African American and Hispanics in this country. And that's just going to continue. So that white people who have dominated the country, been 72 or more % of the population, are going to lose their demographic advantage, and people of color are going to move into positions of authority, and that is scary for
and the
people,
other thing that the statistics have shown, and which shocked me, was that the death rates among
White.
demographics of whites have actually gone up.
Yes.
And they've stayed relatively flat for all the other demographics.
Yeah.
And a lot of that's attributed to substance abuse. That's played a huge part. But young whites are dying at much higher rates than their counterparts in the Hispanic, African American, or Asian community.
Right. And I think that one of the reasons behind that is the economy and where the economy is for these guys. Especially, you mentioned youth, and we talked about the obstacles that young people are facing today in terms of the unavailability of jobs and the jobs that are out there that are not paying living wages, and then the debt that a lot of these guys are coming out of college with. But then with older people in their 50s, I think for white males in their 50s, globalization has had an enormous impact on them. Look what's happened here with people that are working in the paper mills and the people that worked in with GM here.
Factories,
When those jobs were shifted, and now you got somebody in their 50s who doesn't know where they're going, doesn't have any of the skills that are needed to go out there, and they end up in very much depressed. They end up using substances to cope with where they are, and that's why we're getting all this stuff going on. So
I mean, if you lose a job in this country after the age of 50, it is very, very difficult to get back on your feet, even if you had the credentials. So you're dealing with that issue, that sub-issue too. And that all came out after the 2008, after the crash. A lot of people in that age range began to lose their jobs, and that trend has pretty much held. If you lose your job, and if the longer you're out of a job at that age, the less likely you are to ever get back into the job market. So that also plays into this equation. And then you look around you and see that all of a sudden the neighborhood's changing, the country's changing, and it's not people who look like me who are the up and comers. And you feel like you're out of place now, or there's no place for me.
And what happens is these guys play on that. They play scapegoat. It's because of these people coming into the country and taking your jobs. It's because of these African American people that are on welfare that are taking all our money. They play on all these things. And when people are scared and somebody comes up with some kind of a solution, they're jumping on it.
I mean, that's right out of the Lee Atwater playbook.
Exactly.
That was all part of that Southern strategy to let people know that you got this encroaching, these people that are going to come in here, and your life's not going to be the same.
Right.
And now they see that actually playing out before their very eyes, just with the demographic trends.
And people that's resonating with these folks because they don't, and I think there's a book that just came out by Jane Mayer, I don't know if you've seen it, called Dark Money. And
I've heard about it, yes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. I just picked it up the other day. I haven't read the whole thing. I just started reading on it. But she talks about how we got to this point. And one of the points that she makes is the media and how the media is in less and less hands, and it's in the corporate hands that are selling a message to the American people that, hey, the problem here is these others, not us, it's the others, and we have to stop them. And then they buy the politicians to carry that message to Congress. So the issues that really are important to people, like not poisoning our people in Flint, like getting decent schools in Detroit, that doesn't get on the public agenda.
Nobody talks about that.
Nobody talks about that. So that brings us to the issue that Bernie Sanders talks about a lot, and that is the influence of money in politics. And it raises a lot of questions about Hillary Clinton.
And he raised them last night because he's the only candidate in the race right now that doesn't have a super PAC behind him. And that says a lot.
It says a lot.
In this era where you have to raise a whole lot of money to even think you can contend and compete and have a 50-state strategy.
Oh, jeez.
I mean, Citizens United basically created this monster.
Right.
And people now have used the system to build up these enormous caches of money. Doesn't always guarantee a win. I mean, you can look at George Bush, Jeb Bush, who had a huge lead in terms of money that he's raised, but he's nowhere in the polls.
That's right.
But I think it also has a debilitating factor because it lessens the power of individuals.
Yeah, that's right. The political power ends up in the hands of the people that got the most money and put the most money into the campaigns. And the idea that this won't influence my vote, this won't influence where I stand in Congress, is ludicrous. I mean, Bernie did a really good job on that last night when he talked about why aren't we going after the pharmaceutical companies? Why aren't we talking about people that don't have health care and the high price of health? Why aren't we regulating prescription drugs and things like that? Because of the influence on the pharmaceutical companies. And so people will say, well, I don't vote that way. No, you keep it off the agenda. You don't even put it out there so that people can talk about it.
I mean, there was a piece that 60 Minutes did, I think, 3 years ago with Jack Abramoff. Who was the famous lobbyist who went to jail. And Abramoff basically said that, you know, we spend this money, we invest, we had this whole row of folks who do this stuff on K Street. We go up to Congress, there's a reason for that. This money gives us access.
Yeah.
This access then impacts policy. You said, and people would be naive to think that that's not the case. Because if I walk up to a senator's office, they know me. He said, if John Q. Citizen walks up, he's not getting in.
No. Talk to a staffer.
What's the difference? The difference is I can bring something to the table.
Right.
I can bring something to the table that senator, that's going to cause that senator or congressman to open that door and say, come in and sit down and have a seat. Let's talk.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Access. Exactly. And I think that what we see happening is that they're spending so much money on these lobbies. I guess the most blatant example of the influence of big money for me was during the George W. Bush administration when, in developing an energy policy, Vice President Cheney invited the oil companies in to write the energy policy that we have for the country. So, I mean, we end up with that kind of a thing, and they don't even take notes, no public meetings, we don't even know what was said, but we end up with a policy which enormously favors this group of people.
And then when the case made it to the Supreme Court, they refused to hear it. Because people wanted, Freedom of Information Act to disclose what happened, when it went on in those meetings. No.
They didn't even hear it.
So you can see the influence all the way there, too.
Yeah, right. So we're in big trouble here. And I think one of the fundamental differences between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton is Hillary Clinton saying, I can work in this system and I can make it work better for you. What Bernie Sanders is saying, we need radical changes in the way the system operates. And just staying within and adjusting some of the what do you call it, the tunes on it, that's not going to do it. We need radical change. We need change as far as the way elections are run. We need change in reining in the corporations. We need change in putting our resources to ordinary people. I think that's a fundamental change. And
it'll be interesting to see whether or not that message will carry throughout the electorate, because you and I both know, Don, that our electorate is skittish about that kind of change. Even if they know that's the formula that's going to work, they're still skittish about it.
Very much
we don't do change. We don't do that kind of radical change very well. The change that we've always used has been incremental change.
Yes.
And in this case, that's far too slow for what we need to have happen in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what causes the problems with infrastructure. We've waited all this time, and we're supposed to be this world-class power, but we have an infrastructure of a country that appears to be complacent.
Exactly.
And everybody knows this.
Yeah, right. And if we would invest in the infrastructure, it would generate a lot of jobs. It would, I mean, look what China's doing and how they've built their infrastructure and what that's done for their economy and done for jobs for people and things like that. So the fundamental, there's an organization out there, I don't know if you've seen that, called the Next Systems Project. It's a very interesting initiative, and they have really good people, that maybe 150 scholars and activists who are on that project and looking at how we restructure the systems, the economic system, the political system, the social system, the educational system, those kinds of things. Their website is terrific. They really do some good things on that. But one of the things that strikes me about that is they have some models out there. For example, when we talk about restructuring the economic system, some of the things that are happening in Cleveland with the Democracy Project, where they've created these cooperatives, and going into some of the poorest neighborhoods in Cleveland and empowered the people there. So they went to, like, one example is they went to the Cleveland Clinic, which is one of the biggest, huge medical facilities in the world. And they said, we want to do your laundry, we want to grow your food. And instead, they were sending their laundry, I don't know, Canada or somewhere. Now, the local people are doing the laundry, generating jobs.
Yeah.
And the company that does that is owned by the people in the neighborhoods. They now provide food. They've built greenhouses. And last year, they grew over 2 million heads of lettuce that they're selling there. They're into solar, and they're building solar panels and putting them on the roofs of public buildings and other places. And it's owned by the people. That's a radical shift, that the people are now in a position where the economy is theirs.
And they have a larger stake in the outcomes of that.
Exactly.
And so they're more likely to invest more.
Yeah.
In terms of blood and sweat.
And working in it, yeah, because we all go up together. Whereas the model that we have accepted in this country is that if we can grow the gross national product, we'll be okay. Yeah. Everybody does better. And we're growing the gross national product, but we're not okay. And I think that's the fundamental.
And the model that we've had for such a long time, our thinking has always been so short-term, quarterly.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking about where do we want to be 5 years from now?
That's
where
right.
do we want to be 10 years from now? All you hear now is the quarterly profit statements. Well, that doesn't give us any insight because the world that we're in now is not going to be the world we're going to be in 5 years from now.
Right.
So how is that really relevant?
Yeah.
And it doesn't give us the ability to make the kinds of changes that we need to make fundamentally in the long run either.
And I agree with that 100%. And I think that something you said earlier is really the key. And that is, what is the measure of our success? And it seems like the measure of our success, as you said, is how are our people doing? How are the people at the bottom doing? Are we bringing those people up? Are we moving those people into the middle class so that they have access to health care, housing, decent education, all those kinds of things? That's what we should be measuring. But we're not measuring that at all. That's not even on the agenda.
Because if we create that world, it benefits everybody.
Right. We all do better.
We all do better.
Yeah.
We don't do well and have not done well, and societies historically haven't done well when the inequality between those at the top and those at the bottom gets wider and wider.
That's right. That's right.
That's a bad combination over the long run. Right. And usually it sows the seeds to discord and other things that can happen in society that we really don't want to go down that road.
Right, right. And I think if we're going to talk about how are our people doing, we have to talk about the issue of race. That's been off the agenda. And for a lot of reasons, President Obama has been reluctant to deal with that. One reason, I don't know if you saw the other day on Democracy Now!, there's a new book out called The Black Presidency.
Yeah, Michael Dyson's
Michael
book.
Eric Dyson wrote it. Yeah. And he's saying, look, there's a couple things here. One is, as soon as Obama was elected, the Republicans that day made a pact that we're not going to let this guy succeed.
He's going to be a one-term president. That's what Mitch McConnell said, I think, 3 days after the inauguration. He said, it's going to be my personal job to see that this guy is a one-term president.
Right, right. So he's working against all that. He has no chance to do anything about that. And the second thing is that every time he talks about race, they jump all over him. And so he's been reluctant to talk about this at all. But the consequence has been that the issue of race has not been on the public agenda. And I think it's got to get back on the public agenda.
And it was sort of forced back on, not because of anything Obama did, but because of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Black Lives Matter. Put it back on the agenda.
Pushed it back on the agenda.
Exactly.
And in my work, I tell people, these are difficult conversations to have because people fundamentally don't want to have them.
That's right.
Because to have these conversations, you have to talk about how we got to where we got.
Exactly. History is important.
And Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he was here, said that. He said, I can't talk to you at all about what's going on now if I can't talk to you about what got us here in the first place. So I got to talk about this history. People need to understand this. And that's a painful road for many to go down. Right. Because it means you have to acknowledge and become self-aware that perhaps the advantages that you have, particularly for those who are white in this country, were attributed to things that happened many, many years ago. Yeah. Not that you're at fault, but the advantages that you have in life now can be attributed to things that were set in motion hundreds of years ago.
Right.
And was done at the expense of African Americans and other minorities in this country. And that's a difficult conversation for a lot of people to have.
Very difficult. Because it means I've got to make some sacrifices. So I inherit privilege because of things that have happened before. And it can't be, we're not all starting at the same place. And so we have to make adjustments to that. We have to make adjustments to that.
And that comes back to what you said earlier, and you see that sort of thing play out with the Detroit public schools and this Flint water crisis.
Yeah.
Inequitable relationships over time cause social attitudes and social narratives about what the other is like.
Right.
And may, in many ways, result in inaction.
Yeah.
Or slowness to react when those people have things that are impacting their lives.
Right. And the tendency is to say, how are those people going to change? And when the reality is, how are we going to set up an environment where those people have a chance to succeed?
Yeah, where we at least make it a full-throated attempt to level the playing field.
Right.
Which means you have to make an investment.
Right.
But you also have to acknowledge that the inequality exists in the first place. And a lot of people have a difficult time going there.
Right. Well, we only got 2 minutes left. I'm getting a signal there. We got 2 minutes left. So where are we going from here? What's got to happen? What's the next steps here?
Well, I think the next steps are going to, the ball's in the governor's court with respect to the Flint water crisis.
Yeah.
Because now that you've put yourself out there to say we're going to do whatever it takes to fix this, people are waiting to say, okay, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Put your assets out there then.
Right, right.
And I think that's the next step for the governor. They have to put some tangible assets out there. And the little bit of money that they're throwing at the problem now is not the answer.
Drop in the bucket.
It has to be
$28 million.
Yeah.
I read in one of the articles you sent me that that's less than we spend on
the
clean
pure
Michigan.
Yeah.
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 So
it has to. They have to start acting, like you said earlier, as if this is a priority.
Yes.
And right now they're not doing that. They're talking, but they're not acting as if this is a priority. And if that doesn't happen, a lot of folks' careers and livelihoods are going to be buried as a result of this. Not to mention all the victims of this.
Right. So what's got to happen though is the people in Lansing aren't going to do that unless there's a lot of pressure from the rest of us out here.
And
so we got to continue that.
Has to be continued. Has to be ratcheted up.
Yeah.
Continuously.
Right. So that's the next step. We've got to fight for these things. We've got to fight and put them on the public agenda and make sure that they happen.
And that's why I think it'll be real important to see what happens in that debate when Sanders and Hillary come here on the Flint on the 8th. So it's going to put it front and center.
Yeah.
And I'll be really curious to see how the Republicans respond, or their spin machines, their the media outlets respond, because that's going to be front and center there for that debate.
Right. I'm counting on you to get me a ticket to that, by the way.
And I was counting on you to get me a ticket for that. So,
so we're getting the word that we have to wrap up here. We want to thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you'll watch us next time. So I'm Don Cooney. This is Felix Brooks. Thanks a lot for all your insights, Felix, and thank you for watching us today.
Thank you.